Hello and welcome to This Is Not an Episode, a weekly podcast where philosophy meets the world. Each episode explores how philosophical ideas surface in public life, from fashion and faith to AI and funding politics. And I'm Jonathan Talent, a philosopher. And Andy, who are you?
I am Andy Fisher, and I am also a philosopher with Jonathan at Nottingham University. You said all that, Jonathan, but I'm not sure still why we're doing it. What's the point?
Yeah, I don't know, mate. Why are we doing it?
I guess there's an idea that philosophy is a bit ivory tower and has nothing to say about people's real lives, a bit navel gazing. I'd like to try and disrupt that idea and say that actually philosophers have got a lot to say about interesting things to say, not just lots, about things that are going on in the world, and hopefully allow people to think a bit differently, listeners to think differently about stuff. And it'll be fun. Have a chat to you about some philosophy, so that'll be good. What about you?
Well, certainly, Andy. And always love having a chat with you, and never have enough time. So I think this is a great excuse to get together and have a bit of a chat about what's going on, how philosophy is finding its way into the world in all those fun little ways. And you know what it's like. You'd be reading something silly on the internet somewhere in those vast archives and go, hang on a minute, what that? How does that connect up to what we're doing and how we're thinking about things? And as you say, great opportunity to have a little bit of a chat, explore what's going on, and find out how philosophy is getting traction in the world. And one way it seems to be getting traction in the world at the moment is in prisons. Andy, what's going on?
So really interesting article by Jay Miller in The Guardian about philosophy program is running in prisons. And I mean, philosophy's been done in prisons quite a lot, and philosophers have got a lot to say about prisons, about how to make good prisons. That's Bentham's Panopticon, etc. But what was interesting about his article was he was doing philosophy with inmates in a female prison, but he was also bringing students in, outside students and inside. So there was this outside-inside dynamic, and there's a lot of data that says doing philosophy with prisoners actually helps prisoners in different ways. Duncan Pritchard's got a good article in Teaching Philosophy about this. But also, what was interesting, and also it helps the person doing philosophy. So as an educator, it helps you, just helps you hone your skills. But what was really interesting was it said that the student transformation was quite amazing. There's an ideal, and you'll know this ideal, Jonathan, that when we are at university, students come in and they're free and they talk about philosophy and they challenge ideas and they just try out things. But in my experience, I can't talk for you, but in my experience, that's quite hard to get sometimes. They have lots of baggage, they're a bit worried to speak. But what was really great about Jay's point was, if you bring students into prisons, I don't know the scalability of this, but students they just throw off that and they just go for it. And they have lots of really engaged, interesting, philosophically deep conversations.
It's great, isn't it? And I know exactly what you mean from all of those bits and pieces we've done of philosophy in schools together, where we've got students in to do that kind of work. So I'm kind of unsurprised in some ways that the students have thrown off the shackles and really taken to it there. But I wondered if you were doing this, Andy, and you were thinking about doing philosophy in prisons. I mean, what are you going to do? Because I mean, I'm guessing that what you're not going to do is go to your local prison, find the prison lecture hall, sit a bunch of folks who are in prison down in rows of lectures, and then talk at them for an hour, which I think is kind of the stereotyped way that some people think that educating people in philosophy goes.
Yeah, it's a good question. So my first thought was I was going to hold up the local spa and get arrested and get into prison. No, I'm joking.
Again.
Yeah. I mean, what's key is you're right. There's an idea that education, especially philosophy, perhaps, is some person standing at the front of a big space just talking at people, and they're meant to sort of, like sponges, take on these great pearls of wisdom.
But you've got to have a toga on as well. There has to be a toga, some sandals, big flowing beard. Don't forget all that.
Absolutely, and I think it was the great Idi Izzard that said that, the clever, the intellectual brilliance of a person is measured by the length of their beard. So Marx is a really clever bloke. Look at his beard.
We're in
So
trouble.
anyway, yeah, yeah, exactly. Going back to this though, I think what education is at its best when it's democratic, in the sense that people are sitting in the same space, looking each other in the eye, and chatting as equals. And what I think the prison environment does is it forces that, because everybody's starting from scratch in that space. Like the fact that these people from the outside, students, have got A levels and all these other sort of fancy things probably doesn't mean much in that space. Well, that's what Jay was saying. And equally, what's going on in the prison doesn't mean much in terms of credence in that space for the people, the other students. So actually, you're starting from a space where people are equal, and I think that's really liberating. And that was true even as the educator. Jay was saying that he was part of the group. He felt he was learning stuff as he was going. So that's powerful, and it allows you to dig deep into some really key issues in a way that perhaps a formal educational setting with lots of assumptions doesn't allow. It's like I guess what it does is sort of shifts perspectives in a way which is a way which perhaps normal educational environments don't. Talking of shifting perspectives, there was some interesting work on drugs and philosophy, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, and thanks for throwing to me for the article on drugs. I really appreciate that. My reputation will take an appropriate change of direction, I'm sure. No, but you're right. There was a really interesting piece that I saw this week in Unheard by Justin Smith Rue. If that's the correct way to pronounce his name, and my apologies to him if it isn't. Discussing whether philosophers should take psychedelic drugs. I've never seen the suggestion before. I've heard the suggestion that philosophers should pay more attention to the external world before, but more attention to the psychedelic drugs was a new one on me. We can link to it below, but I think that the main idea for the article was this idea that philosophers are often trying to engage with reality, with what's out there, and sometimes what Justin says, I should be very clear, Justin says psychedelic drugs enable us to do is to get a different perspective on that world, to come to see things kind of differently, and to engage, therefore, in a way that we wouldn't normally think about reality. And, what's philosophy for doing if not for prompting us into those kinds of directions? I don't know if you've ever heard a call for more psychedelics in the philosophy classroom.
I have actually, but from
Have
a
you really?
student. I had a student last year, and he and a few other of his friends wanted to do more and he wanted to write. I'm trying to remember, he actually did write in the end, but on the role of psychedelic drugs in education as a way of changing the educational space. But that was the only one. I have heard of psychedelic drugs. So there's a tradition in Taoist philosophy. Right? So Zhuangzi writes some really weird stuff. And there's a famous philosopher writes about him, Professor Singerland, and his thesis is that he was off his face, basically, right? It's like a part of the shaman tradition. You just get off your face and then you write about some really cool stuff. So, there's a bit of that, but not much. And I think it's a good point. I mean, it also reminded me of that idea that sometimes we need something serious to change perspective. So in the feminist literature, they often cite sort of Jane Goodall's work with chimps. Like, here's a very male dominated space and they're not getting anywhere. And actually it took her a lot of effort because of epistemic injustice, namely they didn't take her claims seriously, to say, well, actually, she's saying some really amazing things about tool usage and society. And she was accused of anthropomorphizing. But it's just like, without that change of perspective, that whole stuff, that really, fruitful stuff, is not unlocked. And I feel there's maybe something, I don't know what you actually practically do about this, but yeah, I mean, what was your takeaway? Do you think, is there something in this, drugs and philosophy? Yeah,
I mean, my honest response is maybe, right?
yeah,
I don't know. That there were a couple of places where I got a little bit uncertain about what he was saying in the article. Just in places where he's sort of, there's a passage where I think he says something like, "The trouble is that Western philosophy has long valorized the sober, lucid mind above the drugged, drunk, or dreaming one." Um, and I'm like, well, yeah, I tend to do my best thinking when I'm not drunk. Um, so that probably sounds about right. So I take the point that, there might be something to be said for seeing the world differently, but I'm not totally persuaded that this is automatically a route to that. Um, and there were a couple of places as well where I think he says something along the lines of, philosophy is, really concerned with meanings and arguments, but not with what lies beyond these. Um, and yeah, but maybe that's because it's doing philosophy. Don't know. What do you think?
yeah. Often with these things, there's a really good nugget of insight, and then there's a lot of fluff around the outside. So the idea, it seems like a really good point. Like, let's listen to people from different walks of life with different experience, and even experience that yourself. I'm thinking of, Angela Davis and sort of lived experience, Black feminist movement, stuff like that. You can't know until you've walked in those shoes. Um, and I can see that. But then there's this sort of overreach, I think, in some aspects. I don't know the details of the article. You read it, I haven't. But in terms of it taps into some deeper metaphysical realism, or some kind of, maybe, right. But the point is, I couldn't work that out unless I was sober, right? Unless
Yeah,
unless I could think through it clearly. So yeah, there seems to be some kind of tension there. A bit interesting. I mean, I'd be interesting to know what students think, actually, see what they say.
for sure. It might be a fun thing to teach.
Yeah.
And speaking of all things teaching and how we do it, as well as whatever's going on in the world of all things mind bending out there. Uh, you were reading this week about what's going on in the philosophy of education in the age of artificial intelligence. Andy, what do we have to read more about AI?
I mean, not much. It's all done and dusted, really. We've sorted AI and education. We're
Perfect.
on to other things now.
Perfect.
No, I mean, it's such a contentious and humongous issue. But I mean, Stephanie Schneider, she writes. We'll put the link in the notes, but she writes that, well, I think it's really important. I think lots of people have thought it and talked about it, but she really crystallizes it really nicely, which is, rather than doing your AI tech stuff and then thinking about what education looks like afterwards, let's ask ourselves what we want education to be like. And she draws on Buber and Freire in terms of dialogue. So education, what's important is the humanity of dialogue, and that's the sort of stuff that's really develops flourishing and our humanity. And let's try, and we can't stop AI, it's here, right? And anyone who thinks you can is naive. Can we somehow help ourselves in that dialogue and that flourishing by using the tech? And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it, being upfront, saying we can't dodge this, but saying, what do we want out of education? What we want, and it's going back to the prison stuff, right? What's really powerful about what was written and what was really sort of profound was the fact you get genuine, dialogue, people saying what they really think in the same space, and there's that sort of connection. Boob was really clear and profound on this stuff. And can we do that? I mean, she doesn't give any practical solutions, but what she's doing is sort of giving a format for that. I wasn't 100%. I'm convinced that dialogue's important in education, in that sort of connection. I'm not convinced you can't get it with AI. I think so. That's a bit controversial. But I think as humans, we really want it to be true that we can't get it with the AI. But if you see the massive rise of things like the companion bots and AI companions, and or the sort of personalization of AI, and people, saying things like, I'm in love with ChatGPT. They're my better friend, and people are talking about it as a sort of a solution to loneliness. So, and you think of people like the Khan Academy, who uses AI in dialogue in things.
You're absolutely right, and you're putting me in mind there of some stuff I've been reading outside of philosophy, where there's been some fascinating investigations of the ways in which people attribute mental states to artificial intelligence, and the way that that helps drive their relationships and actually makes them trust the artificial intelligence in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. And they've looked at stuff like putting face-like appearance in there to make the AI more trustable, and that seems like it works. But there's this huge idea that the more you anthropomorphize the AI, the more actually, yeah, we just relate to it. We get on with it. We're social beings, and the artificial intelligence plays that social role.
And there's some, I could talk about this loads. It's fascinating, but there's some really interesting moral psychology on. As you know, they've used quite a bit robots in care homes, and how they are. Again, there's sort of like there's a real genuine relationship build up with patients and people in care homes, especially dementia patients. And there's some really fascinating work on that. How there's this sort of almost instinctive connection built up. So you can actually, with people who've built up a relationship with these robots, these bot things, you can actually show them that there are batteries, and you can take the batteries out, and you can do all this stuff, but they still are convinced that their puppy or their seal or whatever it is they're relating to is real, and they do that. And I really, in some sense, I really want it to be true that there's some kind of humanity lost, but I find it really hard to pin down, as a philosopher, pin down what that actually is, because on the surface you get all the things you do get with these relationships. I'm not going to let my wife hear me say that, but relationships are really obviously very rich. But in the end, what is a relationship? Isn't it just those interactions? Yeah, in terms of that dialogue we were talking about. So, yeah.
So what you're telling me, Andy, is that our next co-authored paper together in a philosophy journal needs to be, what is a relationship? And we can do some nice metaphysics and epistemology of that question. But before we go and do that, just coming back to that question around the use of AI in education, if I put you on the spot and said, all right, how do you want to embed AI in the way that you do and teach philosophy? What do you want to do with it?
Really good question. I think, assuming that you can't take it out of the system completely, because I think actually, and I've thought long and hard about this, I think in the end, if you could, I would remove it out of an educational context. But given you can't, I think what I'd like to do is have it actually as a personal tutor. I don't mean well-being tutor, I mean an academic tutor. So I think helping students learn how to interact with it as like a Socratic dialogue almost. So I think I'd like them to be better at that, and therefore, so I could say, look, here's a claim. Go away, interact with the chatbot on this, and perhaps let's have a chat about that when you come back. So it's a sort of like, I guess I'm thinking of it like in sport you have the drug enhancements. So perhaps the AI bot should be thought of as like a drug enhancement version in education, where people are just getting this extra kick in terms of their critical thinking and their ability. And I think training students of that, I think, is key. There's a whole stuff about assessment, but yeah. So I think I would like, because if you think about I don't know about you, Jonathan, but as a student, some of the best times I had in terms of education stuff was actually just having one-to-one chats with people, and then critically saying, well, hold on, why do you think this? Actually, I don't really know. I've always just said it because my mate said it. So And of course, there's only one lecturer and 300 students. So if you can allow them to chat to these chatbots in that sort of critical way, maybe even predisposing the chatbots to have certain philosophical tendencies, then you can do that real critical reflection challenge on a one-to-one basis en masse.
So it sounds to me then like what we need to go and do is a bit of prompt engineering as well, to try and work out exactly what do we ask, how do we get the relevant LLM to engage, to take on the right kind of persona, to challenge our students. And that might be quite a fun thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the right move. I think that the idea that we should train students to be prompt engineers, and essentially that's all we're doing in education, is the wrong. I think, I mean, in going back to Stephanie's point, what's key is that critical engagement, genuine dialogue, etc. I think where I depart from there is I think you can get that in that AI context with the right prompting and the right changing of the chatbots in the right way.
Changing of the chatbots, changing of the guard. It all sounds it sounds great. We'll go away and we'll get it all sorted pretty much immediately.
Yeah, of course, definitely. Yeah.
Great. Well, Andy, it has been fantastic chatting with you this afternoon. Should we do it again sometime?
Yeah, let's do that. It's really good to actually just have a good chat about some philosophical issues with you, and in a way that's not confined by all the other things we have to do in the week. So yeah, thanks for your time. Appreciate that.
Likewise, Andy, and thanks for yours. And I suppose we hope that you've enjoyed listening to us have our little wander through those philosophical topics. Between now and next time, we'll be keeping an eye on what's going on in the world of philosophy. And we'll be back next time to talk to you all about our incredibly insightful reflections. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.